I'm very happy to welcome back to this radio program Ilan Pappe. Ilan Pappe is professor of history at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies and director of the European Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter. He's the author of many books, including his latest, which he joins us to talk about. It's called Lobbying for Zionism on Both Sides of the Atlantic. Ilan Pappe, it is a good pleasure to welcome you back to the show. Thank you for taking this time.
It's great to be again on the show. Thank you for having me.
I feel like this is the timing of our conversation is sort of perfect. Yesterday, Ilhan Omar, Democratic representative from Minnesota, won her primary election. Hence, she's more than likely to win the general election to maintain her seat in Congress. Notable because Ilhan Omar has been one of the more visible and vocal critics of both Israel's policies and actions towards Palestine, as well as U.S. policy towards Israel and Palestine. And I say notable because a couple of her colleagues who have also been critical both of the United States and Israel, Jamal Bowman of New York and Cori Bush of Missouri. Cori Bush is the one who sponsored a resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. Both lost their primaries earlier this summer after APAC and its affiliated groups had spent something around a combined $24 million against both of those lawmakers, which was an astronomical amount of money for a congressional primary race. They didn't spend as much money in Ilhan Omar's race. Maybe that's because they just didn't feel like they had the constituency that they can grasp onto. But still, so significant Ilhan Omar wins, but we're still in a moment in which we've seen a couple of lawmakers, precisely because of their criticism towards Israel and the United States, get the wrath of, well, what we usually call the Israel lobby. You call it lobbying for Zionism. We'll talk about that distinction as well. But what's your reaction to what's happening in American politics, and especially what's happened to, say, Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman?
Yeah, I think it kind of manifests two things that I'm sure we will also discuss when talking about my book. On one hand, it exposes a pattern of continuity, namely the ability of APAC, just by the sheer power of money, to silence reasonable moral voices that reflect much better, actually, what especially democratic voters feel about what goes on in Palestine, and yet making sure that the people who hardly represent what most democratic voters, I think today about Gaza are still re-elected or reappointed and so on. So money, as we know, it plays in the American democracy a huge role, far more sometimes than moral values, moral positions, or even reflecting genuinely and authentically the wishes of the electorate. So you have, on the one hand, this kind of continued legacy, if you want, of what I call the Zionist lobby, which has been in action with such methods in America since the end of the First World War. So it's not surprising that it's still successful. On the other hand, it also exposes, in Han Omar's case, exposes that one should not take a determinist view about its power or a teleological view about its power. Ilhan Omar is an indication that power and money is not everything, even in politics. And that we are seeing maybe a process that is too slow for the taste of many of us, but is ongoing, a process, an incremental a process by which the views of the public opinion, of the civil society, are sipping into the structure of policy making. It's not enough. It's too isolated. It's still marginal. It's not at the very center. But watching, and I'm no expert of American politics, but watching Kamala Harris and even before that Biden navigating the various constituencies that they think exist in the Democratic Party. It's the first time in the history of the United States that a constituency that supports Palestine has to be calculated in, factored in. I'm not saying it's the only one, but definitely when it comes to a swing state like Michigan, this is a topic. If we would have imagined 20 years ago that Palestine would be an issue, the only way we would imagine it is who could show that he or she are more loyal to Israel. Now we are also saying some of them have to show that they care about the Palestinians. And this was unthinkable 20 years ago. So it's a mixed thing. It's the old system is still working ruthlessly, but all these indications that there is an alternative are also showing up. And I think that's what we learned from the last 2 days.
And you suggest that it also shows a weakness of the Israeli lobby and their actions right now because of this dynamic.
Yeah, the weakness is that there is a kind of a shift that I don't think we are all aware of it. And this is much more general than Israel and Palestine, and that's about the definition of what is politics. And I think into this discussion is really politics a human pursuit that is totally void of moral values, any compassion, any solidarity? Is it really, what the left always hoped it would be, and in many cases, unfortunately, not succeed in getting to power? And when it got to power in some places, it didn't work too well either. But I think that there is this kind of thing that if this politics still exists in the minds of people, money and intimidation are not powerful enough to destroy it. In other words, if civil society shows solidarity with the Palestinians and translate this solidarity into the way it elects representatives and so on, with all the might of the lobby, they don't have the weapons, they don't have the methods to deal with it. I always compare it to the way the Israeli military power was good enough to deal with neighboring Arab armies and so on. But when it came to the popular resistance of Palestinians who didn't have anything comparable to the Arab armies in terms of weapons, experience, military know-how, still, that's where Israel failed. Most of the Israeli failures, in the end of the day, are against the resistance of a liberation struggle. They were quite successful in fighting conventional armies. And I think there's something, it's not the same case, but I think the lobby is based on a certain understanding what politics is about and people's relationship with politics. But if this is changing, and I think in 2008 we saw even a genuine attempt to change it, which failed, then the lobby can be irrelevant to some of these hopefully new developments.
There is a long history of lobbying for Israel, lobbying for Zionism. We'll get into that distinction if there is one in a moment. But there's a long history of the lobby targeting lawmakers that it thinks is critical of it or not sufficiently supportive of it in the United States. So it's not new what we saw with Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush. In fact, I think many people may be surprised to hear a name I'm going to throw out there. One of the first people to be targeted was William Fulbright. William Fulbright was the longest serving chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he served for decades. But in 1970s, he was targeted by the lobby. And I say maybe be surprised to hear the name William Fulbright because this is the prestigious scholarship that the American government does to send students abroad. The Fulbright Scholarship is named after William Fulbright. Tell me about what happened to William Fulbright.
Yeah. Well, William Fulbright, who came from Arkansas, was interested also as an academic, not just as a politician, in international relationship, and also the connection between the international system and American politics. And one of the things he was worried about in the early 60s was the possibility that foreign countries can use the American system to influence the foreign policy whether on moral basis or against what he would have deemed the American national interest. And I don't think he came to hunt down APAC, but when he started looking at it, one example stood up, and that was APAC, a kind of open lobbying for a foreign country through violation of every American regulation and law about what is allowed and what is not allowed in lobbying. And then he also found out, and I think that has to do with his sense of decency, that what APAC did, because he was aware that it was really, sailing close to the wind when it came to breaking American law, they tried to sort of cover it up with a system that he found it very easy to expose, and he was surprised that nobody ever said anything about it. What APAC did, it supposedly recruited money in the United States for the sake of the deprived sections of the Israeli society. But the money, only part of the money, reached these deprived sections of the society. Part of the money went back to the United States to fund APAC, which is totally against American law. Now, he wanted to have a public hearing with APAC in the committee, but the lobby pressured the president to make sure that it only be in closed doors. So it was in closed doors. And he was a veteran politician. He understood that the closed doors would mean that the public would not be really aware of what was going on. So in a way, he leaked the gist of his report to Newsweek, that devoted one of its bulletins, one of its issues to this topic, and it became quite a scandal in a way. So APAC went to war, and how do you go to war against Fulbright? You put money in the coffers of his rival in the next elections. And I bring a quote in my book from the rival himself, who says, they gave me more money than I needed, really. He said, I use the word coffer because that's the word he was using. He said, they filled my coffers with so much money, I didn't need all of it. And they succeeded in ending his career. And when there was a question whether Johnson would, later after Kennedy's assassination, whether he would be appointed, a foreign Secretary of State, the lobby was there also to make sure that this appointment would not take place.
When did this happen?
We're talking about between 62 to 65, but it goes on. It goes on because every now and then his name is brought up as a candidate for Secretary of State, also in the 70s. And the last thing that he did, I don't remember exactly the year, I can check it in the book, but there's a year where Israel asked senators, and they wanted all of them almost, to sign a declaration in support of Israel in the New York Times against the United Nations attempts at peace because they were undermining Israel's security and so on. And he refused. And then again, they renewed their attacks on him. So we're talking about the 60s and the 70s, not all the time, not intensively, but every now and then, whenever there's a chance for him in a way to return to politics, they come to action. And they destroy him. They destroy his... not totally, because as you said rightly, there's the prestigious scholarship named after him, and he left a legacy, especially in education, as we know, and so on. But he was destined for much higher positions.
I mean, it's a remarkable story, and you're right. We still know the name because of the scholarship, and I'm sure people who specialize in foreign policy are even more familiar with William Fulbright. But I to be very honest, I did not know this story about William Fulbright until I picked up your book.
Yeah. Not many people paid attention at the time. APAC was not very much on focus in the 60s and the 70s. I think the public or the mainstream media became interested in APAC's power much later, in the 90s and in the early in the beginning of the 21st century, and of course Meschmeyer
Walt.
and Walt's book contributed to that. But until these two excellent professors wrote their book, it was mainly activists who kind of dealt with it. So you had the feeling it's a political position against APAC until we had some sort of academic research. But there were other great work by Roger Hickson and Grant. I mean, people were beginning to pay attention and did good scholarly work that exposed. But in those years, in the 60s and the 70s, it looked totally legit what APAC did, and you had to be very courageous, and you would have paid a high price.
Where does APAC come from?
APAC began actually. It began as a section in a former body that was a pro-Zionist lobby called AZEC, the American Zionist Emergency Committee. Why emergency? Because it was founded during the Second World War, and the emergency was meant to deal with the plight of the Jews under the Nazi Germany. But the name remained, although even after the Second World War ended. And it transformed, like so many of the Zionist groups during the Second World War. They transformed from dealing also with the plight of the Jews wherever they are into being totally devoted to helping the Zionist project in Palestine. So the main body was called AZEC, the American Zionist Emergency Committee, and its PR section turned into a body by itself, because the guy who was running it, who came from, God, I forgot the name now. It will come back to me, because most of them came from that state. Somehow it avoided me. C. Cannon, who ran the PR department for AZEC, in collaboration with especially after 48, after Israel had its own delegation in the United Nations led by Abba Eban, the famous Israeli super diplomat. They both thought that AZEC is not enough, that you need a far more assertive, a far more aggressive body to make sure that American policy is not against Israeli interests. And the reason that they did it was that immediately after Israel was established, a few years after Israel was established, Truman, who was the president, Harry Truman, who was the president while Israel, by the way, I remember the place, he came from Cleveland, anyway, come back to me. Harry Truman, who was the one who supported Israel's establishment in 1948, as you probably know and your listeners know, he was replaced by Dwight Eisenhower. Now, Dwight Eisenhower, especially with support from the State Department and even the CIA at the time, were not great supporters of Israel. They thought that Israel is not serving the American interest in the Middle East. They also thought that Israel is pursuing the wrong policy towards the Palestinian refugees. They believed, Eisenhower and his team believed that there was no reason that Israel should not allow the Palestinians who were expelled in 1948 to return to their homes. And the feeling was in Israel that, American administration can be a rival rather than an ally. And that led for the ideas of Cannon and Abba Eban to say AZEC is not enough. We need something which is far more aggressive, far more comprehensive in the way that it influences American policy. Namely, it's not just about politicians, it's about universities, it's about radio. There was no television yet, but it's about radio, it's about newspapers, it's about community centers. And that's how APAC developed out of the Israeli delegation in the United Nations, together with the public relations section of the former lobbying body, APAC.
That's remarkable. And I think oftentimes forgot that within the United States government, especially in the late 40s and through the 1950s, there wasn't unanimous agreement on U.S. policy towards Israel. That you had people like even President Dwight D. Eisenhower, and you said the CIA even was, I guess we say, circumspect about what's happening.
You had the Dallas brothers. One was heading the CIA, and one was the Secretary of State for Eisenhower. And they were, I mean, they were not sure that this total unconditional support for Israel serves the American interest. I don't think they were moved that much by the Palestinian plight or so on, but they had a wider perspective of the Arab world. And they said, is it worthwhile alienating the whole Arab world for supporting one Jewish state? And in those days, which doesn't happen anymore, in those days, people were still listening to what some people call derogatively, but I don't, the Arabists in the State Department. These were very veteran American diplomats who knew the language, knew the area, spent long periods in the Middle East, felt affinity with the decolonization of the Arab world. We have to remember, the United States supported, people don't remember it anymore, supported liberation struggles against Britain and France. Unthinkable, right? Unthinkable today. And they felt loyal to the new Arab states that liberated themselves from European colonialism. And some of them even loyalty to the Palestinians. So, it was a different period. And I think APAC's greatest success is to make sure that alternative voice, God knows, could have really changed the course of history in Palestine and Israel, was silenced in the end of the day.
And APAC was a critical force in making that happen, even early on in its formation.
I do believe so. I think it's what. Yeah, sorry. I think it's one of its greatest success. The other reason its voice was not heard is nothing to do directly with APAC. It's the way the oil companies in the United States found out that the Arab rulers who matters in terms of oil businesses are willing to turn a blind eye to the case of Palestine. So I think that's also a factor that at the time those Arabists were not aware of. They couldn't have been. But as the years went by, they suddenly felt that, or not they, but the policymakers said, we can unconditionally support Israel and still get what we need in the terms of fossil energy and petroleum and oil. And once that did not clash, or that the arms sales, you could sell arms to Israel and to the Arab world. Once all these interests of the industrial military complex did not clash with support for Israel, the moral voices among the Arabists lost their power to influence policies.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are